Sup drivers, today I'm going to help walk you through assembling one of my SCX24 twin I-beam kits, whether you're using double barrel shocks or the ProLine 50mm big bore oil shocks like these. This video is intended to help answer any of those questions you may have about the hardware you'll need, where it goes, and how everything works together. Now before we do anything, let's first go over what to expect inside the kit or what to expect if you're printing the kit yourself. If you're printing the kit yourself, obviously you're going to have access to print all of the trailing arm lengths. And if you're ordering the kit already printed, you're going to need to make sure that you're choosing the trailing arm length for your truck. As you can see here, I've set aside the ones that you're going to need for my build, which is going to be the length for a Bronco and AX24, which comes out to about 58mm eye to eye. Then we also have ones for the Deadbolt, which is going to be about 68mm eye to eye, and then ones for the Gladiator, which is going to be about 78mm eye to eye. Once we've determined the trailing arm length we're going to have, this is going to be the main kit we're going to see. We'll have two sets of twin beam arms themselves, and that's intentional because one will provide a little bit more space for the big bore shock. The next pieces we'll look at is our magnet mount with our front shock mounts. This is where your twin beams are going to connect, and this is where your servo is also going to mount. And then ultimately your magnet mount will be here, as well as two different options for shocks. So one thing to notice about the magnet mount is that now it also has a little bit of extra clearance to hopefully fit most high voltage servos. It won't come with any magnets already installed. You'll have to glue those on yourself if you're going to be running magnets. It's also pretty shallow, so if you're wanting to just run a piece of Velcro on top of here instead as well, you can go that route. The next component is semi-optional depending on the chassis and shock mount setup you might already have for your rig. You're going to be building one off of a stock chassis rail like mine is. This is going to help give you another ESC or battery placement, as well as provide plenty of rear shock mount placements depending on how you're building your truck. The reason mine are in separate pieces is to print easier and stronger for an overall faster and better assembly process. Now before we tear down this truck to rebuild it for you on camera, there's going to be a couple different things we're going to want to know. You'll notice that there's no upper links up front, as well as these being two different length links. If you have a set of threaded links already from another kit, you might get away with just using those to create these links that you need. However, I went ahead and just created my own, and I'll show you how easy it is to do it yourself as well, and it's super cheap. And in the rear, it's pretty simple as well, just using a couple of stock upper links there. You'll need the obvious spare screws and hardware from an SCX24, as well as having a handful of these pivot ball screws, both threaded and unthreaded, that you would typically use in a set of links or shocks. Just like the front links, you'll also need to create a set of steering links. Now these ones I got away with creating by using a set of spare links from an AX24 and just unthreading them a little bit. But just like the front links, you can create these yourself as well. Now with my interior off, you can see it's a little bit less intimidating and a lot more clear as to how it's all put together. The extra thing to notice is the sort of sway bar setup I have back here in the rear. Now this is not part of the kit, but it's something that can help overall stabilize the rig, especially when you get into higher speeds. You can check out SWD_RC on Instagram. He sells some really nice sway bar kits for these trucks, as well as having some really neat Prerunner builds to check out, but we won't really be covering this part of the build in the video. With our chassis stripped, before we move on, let's talk about some more power options and gearing. Now since this video isn't about how to make this thing super fast or anything like that, I recommend you go check out Sinister Customs on YouTube. He has several videos where he talks about how to make these things quick. He breaks down the differences between the gearing options, how you can do different motor setups between the batteries to make these things really wake up. This is just a simple brush setup to get you going and to still have some fun while still making it plenty manageable. What you see in this truck is simply a mofo RC Buzzsaw motor, and the reason it looks a little bit crazy between the transmission case and motor is because I just have a couple of micro heat sinks stuck on. You can get a bag of them pretty cheap on Amazon, and I'll link some of the extra parts down in the description below. But in general, the heat sinks are going to help keep the temperature of the transmission and motor down. Since this thing's going to be mainly pinned on throttle anytime you're driving it, it's going to start to generate a lot of heat. Inside of here, I also have the Mod 5 gears, which is going to give you a little bit of a stronger tooth than your typical Mod 3. However, if you stay with the Mod 3 gears, you still might get a little bit more speed out of this setup by going with the super tiny transmission gear that mofo RC also offers. When I was building this truck, they just didn't have any in stock, so I went with the Mod 5 for just a little bit of a stronger tooth. The main difference inside here is that we went ahead and added a 12-tooth overdrive gear as well. And because we're converting this to a Prerunner style truck with the I-beam kit, it's now going to be rear-wheel drive. So you won't even have to worry about a front drive shaft or axle or anything like that. If you're wondering whether or not the high voltage servo you want to run in your truck will fit, the first thing you're going to want to do is measure this part of the ear to the base. And as long as this comes out to around 19.5 to 20 millimeters, the servo you have should fit with the rig. Otherwise, you're going to want to try and find something that's a little bit more of a low, like this EcoPower digital micro servo. Or just a simple Emax servo will work fine, and both of these can be found for around like 15 to 20 bucks. This is all just to make sure that the servo will still fit underneath the channel of the magnet mount, so you can still run the body mount without any issues. As for the chassis rail here, you can see we're still just using a basic standard deadbolt chassis rail. If you have an aftermarket chassis rail, it might work just fine. However, if you have an aftermarket chassis rail, that means you might also have a stock rail laying around, which would be perfect for using for this, especially since I'm not going to be doing any type of crawling competitions. You really don't need any special type of frame. Now we're just about ready to start bolting things together, but there's one more important step I want to make clear before you screw anything to these 3D printed parts. Although the parts are tough and printed with plenty of thickness, just keep in mind that they are still plastic. What I recommend doing is taking a small piece of hardware like this that you have plenty of control over and simply just pre-thread any of the holes on these printed parts before assembling them together, like the shocks into these trailing arms or anything to the chassis. Just take this into consideration. Anytime I'm going to be doing this, I'll be doing it off camera, and you can assume that I've already pre-threaded all of my holes. Now, starting with the assembly of our trailing arms, you'll need 2 of these pivot ball studs for each trailing arm. The important difference to note about the pivot ball to use is the top and bottom ring are 2 different sizes. And this is the type of pivot ball that you want to be using in your trailing arm. Starting with the rubber gasket on the thick ring end of our pivot ball, go ahead and press the small end through our link hole, followed with fitting another rubber gasket on to lock it in place. And then we'll go ahead and repeat these same steps for the remaining link holes on both of our arms. Now with our chassis flipped over, you're going to want to have the bucket on the upper side, so we'll flip this upside down like so and assemble it to the axle here. Now I didn't have a long enough screw to go from this end all the way through, so what you'll notice here is that I have a threaded pivot ball stud in there, 1 screw coming in on this side just to help hold it in place, and then I'm going to thread the other one into this half here. Throughout this assembly, I'm going to be using a couple of these different little spacers. These specifically come with a couple different shocks like my Proline big bores and the Endura shocks. Typically, these small ones are about 1 millimeter thick, and these larger ones are about 2 millimeters thick if you want to make your own. So with that, we're going to go ahead and use one of these 2 millimeter spacers between our trailing arm and chassis here, and then simply repeat the same thing on the other side. Now we have our rear trailing arms attached to our chassis and axle. And since I already have my ESC and some command strips placed in my battery tray, I'm just going to keep reusing this one for the rest of the video as we assemble it to our chassis. We will first want to install our shock tower mounts, aligning the bottom 3 screws with our battery and ESC tray. And this notch here is going to be going towards the long post on your tray. And now you can just mount this whole rear assembly to our rails, with these longer posts coming right here behind the motor. We now have our rear assembly put together for the most part, which we'll come circle back around to help choose the best placement for your shocks. Now let's talk about assembling our front beams. And just like our trailing arms, we're going to be using the same style pivot ball stud and simply press that through the main link end on our arm. And again, just to help keep it in place, we can press it forward and then fasten on another one of our rubber gaskets. All right, so if you're trying to decide what shock or what type of shock to run on your rig, here's a little bit about what I learned from testing these style shocks, specifically the Proline 50mm big bores, the Endura 40mm big bores, and your typical double barrel style shocks. Now running double barrel friction style shocks is gonna work just fine in this truck. The main thing to note is because it doesn't have that extra dampening that the oil fill shocks will bring us, your suspension just might end up being more bouncy, potentially leading to the wheels hopping a little bit if you hit enough repetitive impacts. This will still provide fun with the truck, however it will make keeping the rig straight and overall stable a little bit more challenging. The Proline 50mm big bores, I feel provide the perfect amount of travel balanced between the dampening with this preload setup and the stiffer option springs. Now when testing both of these shocks, this is the oil that I used. The Endura big bores are the perfect amount of length for the front when compressed to also be able to run a stock knuckle in the correct normal orientation. The one drawback to this, in slow motion videos, I noticed that the Endura big bores up front tended to bottom out quicker on jumps, causing the body to want to bounce back a little bit, where the 50mm from the Proline provides just that extra little bit of travel to where the suspension didn't seem to aggressively bottom out and want to spring the car back up. So running a hybrid of the 50mm in the back with 30 weight oil and the Endura 40mm big bores in the front with a heavier oil and playing with the spring preload might end up being the more ideal setup for your rig. Now we're going to continue this video with installing the Proline 50mm big bore shocks over these double barrel shocks or the Endura 40mm. And the main reason for that is because when running the 50mm big bore shocks, you can see when fully compressed, they don't collapse down quite the same, which in turn is going to cause your body to have a little bit more body lift. And depending on where the wheel meets your fender arch on your rig, we can use Mofo RC brass portal knuckles upside down to help counteract that offset that comes when running the Proline 50mm. But again, running these 40mm Injora shocks up front honestly might be perfect for what most people are going to do with their rig. If you're running these, I would suggest maybe just picking up some 30 weight and even trying out some 50 weight oil and see how that runs with it. Again, the nice part about running these Injoras over the Proline big bores is you can easily run your stock knuckles or stock styled brass knuckles in the correct left and right orientation, or if you want that extra negative camber, you can still run them upside down. You can also run those mofo RC brass portals in the normal orientation and get even more front clearance on those front beams to help dodge obstacles. Now with some of this shock talk out of the way, let's continue. Continuing forward with our big bore oil shocks, I'm going to go ahead and bolt this knuckle to the opposite side so our brass portal is actually offsetting everything upward. Followed by simply bolting the shock on as well. Moving right along, we can build our steering link. You'll notice on one end I have a flat link and on the other end I have an angled one. The angled link is going to be the part that goes towards the servo horn. Like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, you can also make a set of these simply by using a piece of threaded rod like this. These ones here are simply just a couple links from an AX24 link kit that I had laying around, and I've just unthreaded both ends slightly to get the geometry that I have in this setup. On this driver's side specifically, if we measure it from eye to eye, we come in around about 34.61 millimeters. A little bit of tuning is going to still be recommended to get it set up exactly how you want. The more you extend these or bring them in is going to affect your toe in and out. But this is still a good starting point, and then from there you can easily disconnect it from the knuckle and make any adjustments as needed. Again, here I like to use a 2mm spacer between the link and knuckle, but like the rest of it, you can tune it however you see fit. As far as our passenger side steering link, we're going to be at a similar spot around 33mm eye to eye. Moving along to our main servo and base mount for everything, these two are just going to assemble like this using the screw holes in the front of our body mount to secure it to the servo mount. However, it's important before you do this that you install our servo, because with our body mount on here, it'll end up blocking our way in. Let's go ahead and bring our chassis back down to bolt our servo mount on. This is simply just going to slide right in between the rails and line up with the factory holes here. And then now simply feed our servo down and mount it to the base. If you don't have any adjustable links that fit for the front, you can easily make some custom ones by using a simple 2mm threaded rod like this, cutting them to length, and then threading on these bent styled link rod ends with the angle in opposite directions. Now when installing this to your beam, you're going to want to have the bend going to the inside of the truck and the other end bending towards the outside of the truck. Now we can go ahead and flip our chassis back around and start by bolting our links to our skid plate. Now mounting our beams to the servo mount, they'll simply just cross each other like so, and then we can go ahead and screw those in. Next, we'll go ahead and mount our steering links to the servo horn by threading from the top of our servo horn down. Again with this, you might want to still do some tuning yourself, but I like to add another one of those 2mm spacers and then continue to thread it on a little bit more, followed by bringing over our first steering link from the passenger side and then our other steering link from the driver's side. Just make sure that you don't have any threads gapped in between any of these pieces, and the screw is threaded down all the way. Now we can take our magnet mount and wrap it around our servo mount, bolting them together. Finally, we can bolt our front shocks on, and if you're using big bore shocks like this, you don't need any additional spacers because it already has one on the pivot ball. Now if you're using a standard double barrel shock, I recommend tossing on one of those 2mm spacers, and I'm going to go ahead and use the upper shock mount that's connected to the body mount. With the whole front end of our suspension complete, let's go ahead and finish mounting our rear shocks. Now this part of the install is going to depend on several different variables, one being if you're running a sway bar like this one here, and another depending on the different types of shocks you could be running, whether it's the big bores again, or something like a typical double barrel shock. Now another option from running one of these sway bars is you can take an extra shock from the same mounting spot to our axle, and this can help overall stabilize everything and reduce some of the chassis twisting. For my setup and the location where I'm going to start, the shock that's actually doing all the work is going to be here in this back hole on the trailing arm. In addition, mainly for style and a little bit of extra rigidity to help keep this thing square, I'm going to also throw in these double barrel shocks right next to our big bores. But they're going to be set in a place where they're not fully extending so that it doesn't actually interfere with the travel of our big bore shocks. If you're trying to replicate your rig to be just how I have mine set up, Here's the exact holes that I'm going to be mounting my shocks on. But again, you can fine tune this stuff to fit your needs and your body the best. But if you come here down to the second hole, I'll count from 1 and go over 9 to mount our big bore shocks. And then for our secondary shocks, we'll count the third hole from the bottom and go over 8. In addition, we're going to throw on another 1mm spacer to the big bore shock and a 2mm spacer to our double barrel shock. And just like that, the whole chassis is now assembled and put together, ready to throw our wheels and body back on. Hopefully this helped answer a lot of those questions you may have had on how to assemble your SCX24 twin I-beam kit. If you still were left with any questions, go ahead and drop them down below, and I'll do my best to answer whatever I can. I'd really appreciate if you went ahead and dropped a like, subscribe, and follow me on TikTok and Instagram if you want to stay tuned for when we make this pre-runner a lot faster going brushless. Thanks for watching.